Okay, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Tim Stevenson. I'm with Post Oil Solutions, and this is a special edition of our Climate Cafe. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Edward Cameron back with us. Those of you who were here 2 years ago may remember that we dragged him in, and he gave a great presentation. He's a very busy man, so we're not going to keep him late tonight. In his statement to me, this is what Dr. Cameron said he's going to do tonight. He will present the key issues from the IPCC report of this past October, which, as most of you know, I would assume all of you know, was very alarming to many people. But Dr. Cameron is going to look at our whole climate situation in a more positive way. He will look beyond the challenges toward climate change and explore how each of us can use this moment to build a just and sustainable world for all. So, without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Edward Cameron.
So, hello, good evening, everybody. Can I have a show of hands for who was here 18 months ago? So quite a few people, good. So I'm going to try to avoid duplication of too much of the content that we had during the course of last time. And because we have an intimate group, we have plenty of scope for a rich discussion. So please, at any point during the presentation, feel free to put up your hand and look for further clarification. And then we will leave plenty of time for a discussion at the end. It's very important that we recognize that there's a wealth of experience in the room beyond what I'm going to say to you. So it would be very, very useful for you to speak and for you to lend your expertise to the conversation we're going to have. Now, this evening, because we're 18 months after my first talk here, there's a whole series of things that I want to address that move us beyond our first conversation. So first and foremost, I'd like to look back on the last 18 months in climate change, talking about the IPCC report, but also talking about other ways in which the evidence base on climate change has been further established, and also talking about some of both the good and bad ways in which we have responded to the climate challenge over the course of the last year and a half. What I also want to do is to talk a little bit about the American experience. And that obviously gets us into a conversation about the president and his policies, but it also gets us into a conversation about the Green New Deal. Then I would like to talk about what we do to advance climate justice in Vermont. And when I talk about climate justice, I'm very specifically referring to a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive world. Because it's not enough that we avoid unmanageable climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We also have to manage unavoidable climate change by enhancing socio-ecological resilience. But equally importantly, we have to use this moment in time as an opportunity to build a better world for everyone. A world that is more inclusive politically and economically, a world that is more prosperous, and a world where that prosperity is more equally shared. So if we are smart, we won't just treat this as a crisis that needs to be managed. We'll use it as an inflection point to build a better society for all. And I want to talk about some of the ways in which we might go about that in Vermont. And then finally, I want to talk about what I describe as the new climate leadership. Some steps that we can take in our own lives, in our own communities, in the political sphere, but also in the economic sphere. The types of recommendations that I would give to governments and companies, as well as those recommendations that I would give to you as individuals. So this is the broad focus that we're going to concentrate on this evening. Now we're going to start with the IPCC report. And what I want to say from the outset is that the 1.5 degree report that was issued last October should not be seen as an isolated piece of science. It is the latest issue of a long-standing accumulation of scientific knowledge, dating back 2.5, in fact, close to 3 decades. So there is nothing terribly unusual in the 1.5 degree report, other than it suggests our goal should be to hold temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as opposed to holding them below 2 degrees Celsius. So this is the latest installment. It builds upon science that has come before, And what I want to do is to essentially present to you the four main messages, not only of the 1.5 degree report, but the four main messages that come to us from all of the accumulated, peer-reviewed and published science on climate change. The first message is that climate change is unequivocal. It is not a hoax. There is no dispute. It is real. It is happening. We know that concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are at levels unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. We know that that accumulation of greenhouse gas pollution in the atmosphere changes the chemical composition of the atmosphere as a whole. We know that as a consequence of that changed atmosphere, global mean temperatures are rising. And we know that as a consequence of global mean temperatures rising, there's a series of natural impacts and implications. We see an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. We see changes in the distribution of water. Those places susceptible to drought, experiencing more drought. Those places more susceptible to flooding, experiencing more flooding. We see an increase in vector and waterborne diseases. We see sea level rise. We see acidification of the oceans. We see the breakdown of marine systems such as coral reefs as a consequence of warming ocean water and the acidification of the oceans. So we see biodiversity loss, we see ecosystem services loss, we see biodiversity and ecosystem fragmentation. And all of this has consequences for human systems that we'll get onto in just a moment. So all of this is unequivocal. There is no doubt in the science about this. There's no doubt even in the politics about this, as we'll see in a moment when we talk about the Paris Agreement. The second major message from the science is that this process is accelerating. So, for example, when you have global mean temperature rise, you have the loss of Arctic sea ice. And when you lose Arctic sea ice, the ability of the Earth to reflect heat and radiation back into the atmosphere diminishes, and consequently more heat and radiation is absorbed. This accelerates the process of global warming. So we know the more we pollute, the more impacts we generate, the more the vicious cycle spins. The third major message from the science is that this is human-induced. It is not caused by solar flares. It is not caused by orbital variations. It is not caused by tectonic activity. It is not caused by volcanic activity. All of the warming that we are seeing today, the dangerous warming, is a consequence of human activity. The way we use land, our agricultural production, our energy use and mix, our transportation and mobility patterns, our industrial practices, our consumer behavior, and so on. It's a consequence of the way human beings live our lives and the greenhouse gas pollution we generate as a consequence of that. But human is also an important word because just as climate change is caused by human activity, human systems are affected by climate change. So as we see extreme weather events and vector-borne diseases and changes in the distribution of water, we see the undermining of human rights. We see the loss of livelihoods and jobs. We see effects on human health. We see effects on the right to food. We see fatalities caused by extreme weather events. And I'll get into some of those statistics and details in a moment. So not only is it human caused, but the suffering is human in nature as well, which means it's always very important that we apply a human dimension to this issue and not simply relegate it to polar bears and ice caps and glaciers. But the final, extremely important word to remember from the science is that all of this is solvable. One of the things you're going to get from me this evening is a sense of optimism about what we can do going forward. And I'm optimistic in part because I think optimism is empowering. I do not believe an optimist is someone who says, don't worry, we've got this covered. An optimist is someone who says, we can handle this if we get busy. So you're going to find that I'm an optimist in part because I feel it's an empowering message. I feel if I were to say to you this evening, please join me in a suicide mission for a doomed planet, you'd probably find something else to do with your time. But if I say to you, join me in building a better world, you might feel energized, you might feel empowered to get up off your seats, to be activated, to go out and build that better world. So I feel it's an important message to be optimistic. But I also feel that just as the crisis is built on a sound evidence base, the optimism is also built on a sound evidence base. because public policy is moving in the right direction, because corporate behavior is moving in the right direction, because the finance is beginning to flow in the right direction, because people are beginning to get busy. Not nearly as fast as we need it to be, not nearly urgent enough, not nearly to the scale that it has to eventually become, but we now have the foundations to build a better world that we did not have 5 years ago, and that we certainly did not have when I started working on this issue in 1997. In addition to the IPCC report, there's been another series of global reports over the course of the last 18 months that are worthy of attention and your time. The first comes from the World Economic Forum. This is the organization that gathers the great and the good together in Davos, Switzerland every January, when CEOs and political leaders fly in by helicopter to this remote Swiss alpine ski resort in order to settle all of the problems of the world, and some would argue to exacerbate the problems of the world. But the World Economic Forum produces this global risk report on an annual basis. And it's important because it is extremely authoritative, but it's also important because it is extremely influential. Business leaders and political leaders around the world take what this report says very, very seriously. And this year, the findings are very important because you'll see over on the left-hand side, they've identified the top 5 global risks in terms of impact, and they've also identified the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood. And you can see that they are identifying climate change, environmental degradation, and issues related to climate change as 4 of the top 5 global impacts. This means that the World Economic Forum not only thinks it's important for us as humans and for ecology, but they think that climate change is a material risk to business, and they therefore encourage global multinationals with very large, complex supply chains and with substantial financial resources to be activated on this issue and to do something about it. You'll see over on the far right-hand side how the understanding of climate risk and how the demand to act on that risk has rapidly increased over the course of the last number of years. So going back to the end of the last decade, climate risk did not even feature in the top 5 that the World Economic Forum would put in front of people on an annual basis. As of now, it's 4 of the top 5. So this means that the argument and the evidence is going out beyond the scientists, it's going out beyond the environmentalists, and it's reaching into places that previously would have been inoculated to an understanding of climate risk, which is really important. There's also been a recent report by the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. And one of the things that they've done this year, which is really important, is they have begun to strengthen our ability to tie individual climate events to the broader changes in the global climate. So historically, scientists are very reluctant to say that hurricane is caused by climate change. That hurricane is strengthened as a result of global warming. Now we're getting to the point where attribution is strengthening, and as a consequence, the messages that we can relay to people are becoming more forceful. The conclusions that the WMO reached during the course of its most recent report are also quite stark. You'll see here that more than 62 million people around the world were affected by extreme weather events. You'll see that more than 35 million people were affected by floods. And you'll see that there were more than 1,600 deaths in Europe, Japan, and the United States as a consequence of heat waves and wildfires. So we're now able to attribute, we're now able to get a sense of scale, and as a consequence, the ability that we have to tell stories about real-world impacts and not just about scientific projections. Those stories are getting better and better.
Could you say again what WMO stands for?
The World Meteorological Organization. And all of these reports that I'm mentioning, by the way, they're available for free, for download. You can access them simply by putting the name into Google. So the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum, the IPCC 1.5 report, and then the WMO report as well. Now, in addition, since we last spoke together, we have seen climate change jump off the science pages and jump onto our television screens. It used to be that climate change was considered tomorrow's problem, and it used to be that climate change was something that would happen to a distant people in a distant land. And over the course of the last 18 months, we've had a variety of climate events happen across the continental United States that bring this issue truly home to us. So, for example, We know that since 1980 there have been 200 climate disasters right across the United States, and the cumulative cost of these climate disasters is over $1 trillion. $1 trillion buys an awful lot of healthcare, an awful lot of education, an awful lot of infrastructure development, an awful lot of national security, an awful lot of job creation. We have lost a substantial amount of money because we have not taken this risk seriously and we have not begun to act accordingly. What we've also seen across the western United States in the last 18 months is an increase in the number of wildfires, of course wreaking devastation on ecosystems, but also destroying communities, the job base that we depend upon within those communities, and regrettably leading to a whole series of fatalities. We know that during the course of this century already, over the last 19 years, 15 of the 20 largest fires in California state history have burned. So again, this is something that is increasing in frequency as well as intensity. Here closer to home in New England, we are experiencing a rapid growth in vector-borne diseases, particularly those diseases related to ticks, notably, of course, Lyme's disease. There has been a quadrupling of tick-borne diseases across the United States during the course of the last 15 years, and there's now an estimated 300,000 Americans who contract Lyme's disease on an annual basis. Very serious for individual health, but again, very serious for household income, very serious for community economic development. We saw Hurricanes Florence and Michael make landfall in North and South Carolina. These are very interesting hurricanes. And the reason they're very interesting is because historically, hurricanes going through the Carolinas would spin very quickly, pass over land very rapidly, and would cause damage as a consequence of wind speed. As a consequence, the people of the Carolinas have wind insurance. These were new hurricanes. They spun slowly, they hovered over land for a protracted period, they gathered up a large amount of moisture, and they dumped that rainfall all over the Carolinas. The difficult part is that only 14% of Americans have flood insurance, and with these hurricanes, the danger is not wind, the danger is flooding. So this is an example not only of the increase in frequency and intensity, but the changing nature of extreme weather events and how we have not prepared ourselves for these different weather events.
Hi, I'm a meteorologist. I retired from the government last year. A couple things about the ticks that you talked about. One thing that I've heard is that moose are in great danger in this area because they're being bled to death by the ticks. And talking about the second thing, the hurricanes, I did a study a couple of years ago. It was my wife, her family is from North Carolina, and we were down visiting, and the local paper did a story about the North Carolina legislature said on the coast you cannot project sea level rise anything more than a straight line, and the CO2 models obviously going up, and I was doing some work with Penn State, they were shooting way up, and so there's a blindness to the state legislature as well. So.
And we're going to come on and address that blindness in a few moments, because I think it's really important that we truly interrogate why people are blind and how they're blind in different ways, because we need to disaggregate this so that we can come up with outreach strategies that are applicable to different people. Some people are uninformed, and that's fine. I'm uninformed about moose, for example. But some people are misled, and that's a totally different issue, and it requires a totally different response. So we'll get on to that. In addition, we saw, of course, the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, and that has been recorded as the most costliest hurricane season in history. There was close to $300 billion of damage from Hurricane Maria and Irma alone, and most important of all, 3,000 US citizens lost their lives in Puerto Rico, premature deaths as a consequence of these extreme weather events. Now, I always say that it is unfair to compare and contrast different tragedies. They all have their own individual characteristics. But I cannot help but notice that the number of fatalities in Puerto Rico is very similar to the number of fatalities on 9/11. And when you consider the way in which the federal government and we as a society, not just in the United States but globally, reacted to and mobilized in response to what happened in 9/11, and then compare that to how we mobilized and responded to Puerto Rico, you can see the blind spots that have been mentioned. This is a challenge that will define the 21st century. and our response to that challenge has got to be commensurate with its scale. And at the moment, our response to this challenge is to criticize the local populations who are affected and to distribute paper towels to them. That has got to change. If that doesn't change, we will not use this moment as an inflection point. We will simply continue walking blindly into the future. Now, all of this has a price tag, which is very important to bear in mind, because one of the arguments presented by climate skeptics is that acting on climate change is far too costly. The reality is inaction is far too costly, because studies have been prepared that suggest that the amount of assets at risk globally to climate change is somewhere in the region of $24 trillion. That's almost 1/3 of the global economy. Once again, that's money that could be put to productive purposes if it was properly protected and invested. I've already mentioned that 14% of Americans have flood insurance. Another interesting statistic that came out during the course of the government shutdown in January is that 40% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency expense. So think about that statistic for a moment and think about how the intersecting inequalities we have in our society, the structural discrimination we have in our society, the practice we have of paying people a wage below a living wage, the fact that we employ too many people on zero-hour contracts, how all of that exacerbates climate risk by making them more vulnerable to climate extremes. So these points are not only an illustration of the economic cost, they're an illustration of the fact that we need to address economic inequalities if we are to properly manage climate risk. Now, we've also, of course, seen a ramp up in our response. I spoke about the Paris Agreement last time I was here, so I'm not going to dwell on it in great detail, but I am going to give you a quick reminder of the key phrases and the key pieces of architecture from the Paris Agreement. The first thing that I always say is that it is unprecedented in terms of both participation and ambition. So let's start with participation. There are 196 countries around the world who have signed up to the Paris Agreement. Only one of those countries has announced that it intends to withdraw. Of those 196 countries, every single political ideology known to mankind is represented. Theocrats from Saudi Arabia and Iran, communists from China, socialists from Venezuela, conservatives from the United Kingdom, Christian Democrats from Germany, social democrats from the Scandinavian nations. It doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum between extreme right and extreme left. Your ideology is represented amongst those countries who have signed the Paris Agreement. So when we're told that this is a left-right issue, it is only a left-right issue in the United States, and that is a false choice that is being put in front of people. This is not a liberal topic. This is not a Democrat topic. Where I come from, we don't have Democrats. We have 10 political parties. So this is not, and should never be, broken down into a tribal debate between two warring political factions. That participation is holding firm despite the fact that the United States has announced that it intends to withdraw. After President Trump was elected, the world gathered in Morocco, and the first reaction of the rest of the world was, "We're sorry that you intend to leave, but we intend to go further." The second thing to say is that it is unprecedented in terms of ambition, because of those countries, 189 already have national climate action plans and are already translating their climate commitments into national laws. These are commitments to aggressively reduce greenhouse gases, to mobilize finance to build a new climate economy, and to build socio-ecological resilience. There is no other global environmental agreement with the same level of ambition. Second word is that this agreement is defining in terms of its impact on the global economy. It should really be seen as a global economic stimulus and not an environmental treaty. There is more than $13 trillion of new energy investments in the Paris Agreement earmarked for the next decade alone. These are investments in energy efficiency, investments in renewable energy. And when you combine those energy investments with plans around agriculture, industrial processes, transport and mobility practices, urbanization, and so on, you get into the tens of trillions of dollars. So this is not something to be run away from. This is something to be embraced as an economic opportunity, because those trillions of dollars buys an awful lot of economic development. It creates an awful lot of well-paid jobs. Who is going to seize those jobs? Who is going to use that money to expand the tax base? Who is going to use that money to retain and attract young people into their communities? Smart countries are going to use this as an economic opportunity. Those less smart are going to continue to invest in a 19th century energy system as opposed to a 21st century energy system. Third thing to say about the Paris Agreement, however, is that it is elastic. In a positive sense, it is elastic because all of the countries who've made climate commitments have also baked into the architecture a commitment to go further over time. So one of the key phrases of the Paris Agreement is that we will, quote, progressively increase ambition over time. That means every 5 years, countries are obliged to come back to the negotiating table and to increase their commitment based on what they had done 5 years earlier. So it's elastic in the sense that we have the potential to use what was already agreed as a foundation, but to build more solid and more progressive structures on top of that foundation. It's also elastic, however, in a negative sense, in the sense that the United States can, for example, withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and in so doing, it can encourage other countries to think about withdrawal. It can encourage other countries to go slower. And some other countries will do that. Some other countries will say, if the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases, if the country that has profited the most from fossil fuels refuses to act on this issue, then why should we act on this issue? So there is a danger, it hasn't happened yet, but there is a danger that there will be backsliding as a consequence of failure of US leadership. And then finally, it's important to point out that the Paris Agreement is incomplete. Before we had the Paris Agreement, we were on course for over 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rises by the end of this century. The basic crops that we depend upon for food security, wheat and maize, corn and rice, they cannot grow at those temperatures. But as a consequence of the Paris Agreement, we're now on course for between 2.8 and 3.2 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. Still far too high, still the end of coral reef systems, upon which 25% of marine life depends. But we have at least given ourselves a basis upon which to build, and there is a new climate economy created in that space between 2.8 and 4 degrees Celsius. It's now our job to accelerate that progress and to give it a deeper sense of urgency. Beyond the public policy response at the international level, another very important feature has been the ramp up of the response within the private sector. Those who have a long-standing track record of working on climate or other environmental issues will be accustomed to treating the private sector as hostile to our agenda. This is now beginning to change. And we see at present 6,000 companies and investors around the world who collectively represent half the global economy, or $36 trillion, have made climate commitments. These are commitments to purchase 100% of their energy from renewable sources, to transfer all of their vehicle fleets to electric vehicles, to put in place carbon pricing, to advocate for carbon pricing, to end commodity-driven deforestation in their supply chains, to put in place science-based emissions reductions target, to shift their investment portfolios away from high carbon towards low carbon. It is a full range of commitments undertaken by companies right around the world across more than 10 industrial sectors. Importantly, we even see large fossil fuel and high carbon companies, such as the cement sector, taking on these types of commitments. So again, when you hear that climate change is a hoax, if it is a hoax, why is Saudi Arabia committed to this? And why is Exxon committed to this? Because it is not a hoax, and they know that they need to change their practices if they are to thrive in a very different type of economy and a very different type of world. One of the things that's really important to bear in mind over the course of the last 18 years, and I've called this Me Too, but is the increasing awareness of issues related to gender and climate change. So when I was here last time, I talked about this particular statistic on the bottom left-hand side, the fact that 90% of all fatalities to the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh were women. 90% of fatalities to an extreme weather event were women. And right across this slide, you'll see that that disproportionate impact on women is replicated right around the world, even to the point where 80% of the people left behind in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina were women. So the obvious question is, why would that possibly be the case? Are women exposed to an extreme weather event that men are not exposed to? And the answer, of course, is no. In the case of Bangladesh, women cannot leave home without a male guardian. They've never been taught to climb a tree. They've never been taught to swim. They don't have access to information and therefore don't know when the disaster is approaching. They don't have access to decision making and therefore cannot work with the municipality to craft resilient strategies. They don't have access to justice, which means they cannot have redress and hold people accountable for policy failures. They don't have access to financial services, which means it's very difficult for them to save, it's very difficult for them to inherit, and it's very difficult for them to have a credit line to rebuild their lives after disaster strikes. Whether you are a woman, whether you are part of a low-income household, if you are disabled, if you are elderly, if you are a person of color, you are likely to be more vulnerable to climate change than a white, middle-aged Irishman because of intersecting economic, political, legal, social inequalities. So what this emphasizes, once again, is that when we are thinking about climate change and when we are thinking about climate justice, we have to become advocates of social justice as well. We have to become advocates of the least amongst us. We have to become better at diagnosing risk so that we understand vulnerability, and we have to make sure that the policy and other types of remedies we're advocating for address systemic failures like this and are not merely concentrated on reducing energy use or increasing the ambition of emissions reductions within our municipality. If we only treat this as an environment or an energy problem, and we miss the fact that this is a societal problem, then we limit the amount of tools we have at our disposal to actually build that better world.
Question.
Yes?
I was interested in that previous slide, in the bottom right, the statement about women in New Orleans, and I was wondering if you had any explanation for that.
It's what I mentioned. It's the intersection of social, cultural, economic, political, and legal inequalities. So there are certain people who are simply treated like they are invisible, and there are people who simply do not have the capabilities to build the types of resources that we need in order to be resilient. In a little while, I'm going to get onto something called the 6 capital assets. And these are essentially the building blocks of climate resilience. And so these people in New Orleans and these other categories of people that I mentioned, their largest problem is often they don't have the facility to invest in these 6 capital assets, and that's what exacerbates their vulnerability. One of the more positive responses that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months has been the rapid rise in electric vehicles. This is not intended to suggest that electric vehicles are the solution to our problem. It's simply designed to illustrate that change can happen extremely quickly if we invest in it. So the top statistic is an important one. It took 5 years to sell the first 1 million electric vehicles, and in 2018 it only took 6 months to sell 1 million electric vehicles. And you see right around the globe, you see a rapid increase in the rate of electric vehicle uptake. You also see countries like China not only leading on renewable energy, they have the largest solar and wind companies in the world. They are seizing the market for the new energy future in terms of their investments in renewable energy, but they're also building electric vehicles, selling electric vehicles, and putting in place more charging stations, and charging stations that charge the cars more rapidly. So this is a very, very positive story because it demonstrates when you have the right political and financial incentives married with the right technological innovation, we can begin to make rapid progress. Similarly, across renewable energy, back here in 2010, you'll see that the renewable generation capacity was limited, but you've seen close to a doubling of the capacity that we can generate from renewable energy within a 10-year period. And if you look out to 2050, you'll see a doubling of that all over again. So our ability to generate secure, stable, reliable, affordable energy at scale from renewable sources is increasing rapidly. Our understanding of energy efficiency is also increasing rapidly, and consequently, our ability to make investments in these sorts of technologies that are better for our climate but also profitable for investors, that's also increasing. And you'll see that reflected in this particular slide, where during the course of the last number of years, the annual investment in renewable energy has outpaced the annual investment in fossil fuels by more than twice as much. Okay, so there's some of the things that have happened over the course of the last 18 months since the last time that I visited with you, and now there's some things that we're going to discuss with regards to what I call the American experience, and predominantly what's happening at the federal level. One of the interesting quotes I think that has come out from Bill McKibben and others over the course of the last 18 months or so really reflects the interplay between climate and democracy and institutions and systems of government. Jim Hansen, the noted climate scientist, has said it's impossible for us to fix our climate unless we fix our democracy. And Bill McKibben has said something even more striking. He said the particular politics of one country for 1/2 century will have changed the geological history of the Earth. That's really striking when you think that from the dawn of our international negotiations on climate change, right through the Kyoto period and the refusal of both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration to ratify Kyoto, right through to the early years of the Obama administration where they were very reluctant to engage on climate internationally, true of course to the present day where you have the Trump administration withdrawing from Paris and you have deadlock within Congress on this issue. The failure of the United States to show genuine leadership on this issue politically and the failure of the United States to decarbonize its fair share has been truly detrimental to what we're trying to achieve in terms of managing climate change and building a better world. Now, one of the things that we have to do if we're going to change this dynamic, we have to address what I'm calling, for obvious reasons, the elephant in the room. And that is the fact that we now have a very tribal political system in the United States. We have one political party in particular that has abandoned conservation, that has abandoned environmentalism, that has abandoned science. I do not say this as a Democrat because, as I mentioned earlier, I am neither Democrat nor Republican. I am Irish. I say this as somebody who lives here, has lived here for 12 years, and who has my eyes open to what's going on in the political process. If we are to get to a point in the United States where US leadership can be genuine and impactful once more on this issue, we have got to begin to build a societal consensus. We have got to get away from this cycle of boom and bust policy, whereby one administration advances the issue and then the next administration withdraws. We've got to get to the point where there is stable federal policy as opposed to executive orders that can be easily undermined. That means we've got to try and reach out and speak to people who are conservative, who are Republican leaning, and persuade them in language and messaging that resonates with them in a way that does not come across as sanctimonious and condescending, in a way that does not treat them like they are bad people and that we are the righteous. We have to have that conversation and we have to bring them into this tent. That means that we also have to ensure that Democrats do not use climate change as a wedge issue, as a point of differentiation that can be used every 2 years during elections and then forgotten about once they take office. We have got to make sure that we leave a space for other people to walk into that space. So I spend a lot of time going down to DC and talking about this issue with both parties. And I may have mentioned this anecdote before. There's one particular Republican who was a presidential candidate in the last cycle. And this particular person was asked, would he be willing to take a briefing on climate change? And he said yes, as long as the briefing came from scientists from his own state. So the briefing was arranged, and he spent hours with these scientists, peppering them with more than 100 questions. And they answered the questions. And at the end of it, the scientist said to him, do you get this issue? And he said, yes, now I get this issue. And they said, well, will you be willing to speak out on this issue and advocate for it? And he said, absolutely not. And they said, why? And his response was, I don't have a base on this issue. If I speak out on this issue, my own voters will call me a traitor, and you will call me a hypocrite. And his next phrase is really important for us to remember. He said, when people like me step out on the branch, people like you shake the tree. Now, that particular individual showed a tremendous amount of political calculus because he's right. In this divided tribal politics, elected officials do not have to worry about a general election. They have to worry about a primary. There is a 90% incumbency rate in Congress. That is partly a consequence of gerrymandering. It is partly a consequence of voter suppression and systemic problems within our democracy. It is partly a consequence of campaign finance and the interests of vested interests buying political favors. It is partly a consequence of apathy amongst the electorate. There are many, many reasons why this happens, but the reality, the facts, and if we're going to be grounded in scientific facts when it comes to climate change, we equally have to be grounded in the political facts that we deal with. His political calculus is spot on, but his political courage is disgusting. Because it is the job, in my view, of a politician not to read opinion polls, but to lead public opinion. And to come out in front of voters and say, here is what I believe in, here is why I believe in it, please give me your vote. That is not happening. So this particular person is a microcosm for a broader issue within our political system that we need to address.
I can back that up totally. We had a student intern at our office 10 years ago, and she went on to get her PhD at Colorado State in oceanography, and she was a Noah Hawley Scholar, and she went to a symposium in DC filled with extra super smart young people, and they had a representative from, I think he was from South Carolina, and he said, I know it's real. I've been to Antarctica, I've seen the calving of the glaciers, but I cannot, but I will be voted out of office if I go for this. So it's exactly what you're saying.
So when we're dealing with the elephant in the room, we also have to deal with the president. I'm not here to say good or bad things about the president writ large. I'm simply here evaluating dispassionately what the president is doing on the issue of climate change. And what he is doing is damage. And he's doing damage across a number of different spheres. The first is he has put and continues to put climate skeptics and deniers in charge of key government departments. The Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency. Right across government, you see people whose history, whose livelihoods are derived from the Koch brothers, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute in particular is really important to take note of because they did something recently that was extremely clever. They noticed that public school teachers in the United States don't earn a very good living and that public school budgets are pretty limited, resulting in the fact that many science teachers at public schools either do not have science textbooks or often have to pay out of their own pocket to buy science textbooks for the children they teach. So the Heartland Institute decided to send a free science textbook to every science public school teacher in the nation. And that particular science textbook undermines the science of climate change. The people like Myron Ebel, like Bill Wareham, like Andrew Wheeler, like Scott Pruitt, like Ryan Zinke, they come from that tradition. They come from a tradition where the vested interests of the fossil fuel economy have supported their political career. And there's an old adage in public policy that personnel equals policy, because the person on top gets to shape what flows beneath.
I just want to say that it's true because I'm a public school teacher and they came to our school. The books came to the science teachers. So just a fact check, it's true. It's pretty shocking. I looked at them because I was like, what?
And the unfortunate part is that, you know, if you are strapped for cash and if you are strapped for time and if you are trying to do your best for your students, in a normal world, there should be no reason for you to query a science book that you might receive. And so I don't blame public school science teachers for using that resource. What I do is I blame the Heartland Institute for being so manipulative of the education that we're giving to the next generation. I'm going to just go on and come back to these two comments in just a moment because we could very easily get bogged down in conversations about Donald Trump, and I want to make sure that we concentrate on something that's often overlooked. and that is the issue of the federal courts. One of the things that I've been doing recently, started in September of last year, is offering a training course for environmental activists, essentially. I decided that I wanted to, quote, professionalize local activists. Because in Vermont, where I live, in Manchester, I discovered that there was a wellspring of energetic and authentic and sincere and enthusiastic local activists who cared about this issue, but they didn't know how to create an influence strategy. They didn't know how public policy works and therefore how to shape it. They didn't know what they should be paying attention to and what not to be paying attention to. They always seem, as a default, when something needs to be messaged, they put it on a placard and they march down the street and protest in front of a municipal building. I noticed that they were paying attention to the wrong things and that their advocacy wasn't very sophisticated. And one of the most glaring examples of how we fail as activists is that we have by and large ignored what is happening on the federal courts. I don't mean tuning in to pay attention to Brett Kavanaugh. I mean the fact that the administration is packing the federal courts, not at the Supreme Court level only, but across the federal judicial system, with people who are against this particular agenda. And that's really important because all of the federal action on climate change over the past number of years is dependent on executive order. And the executive orders are dependent on Massachusetts versus EPA from 2007. This was a 5-4 Supreme Court ruling that mandated the federal government to reduce greenhouse gas pollutions as an air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. If they change the composition of the court, and if they overrule the Massachusetts versus EPA ruling, it doesn't just prevent one administration from acting on climate change, it undermines the potential of future administrations to act on climate change. Because in the absence of an executive order for the Clean Power Plan or for CAFE standards to enhance fuel efficiency in your vehicles, then you are dependent on an act of Congress. And the ability to pass climate legislation through a tribal Congress, split evenly down the middle in terms of the Senate, is very, very difficult to imagine at this point in time. So this is not simply a slide to illustrate that the president is not the closest ally of climate activists. It's a slide to illustrate that if we're going to be serious about this issue, we've got to be very clear-eyed and sophisticated in identifying the types of battles that we need to fight and understanding how best to fight those battles. Recently, I decided to start giving something I'm calling the Pinocchio Reward, designed to call out the most glaring climate denier of all. And there's a whole manner of different candidates for this award during the course of the last 18 months. I was tempted to give it to Senator Ted Cruz, who likened himself to Galileo as a consequence of the fact that he's a climate denier, neglecting the fact that in fact Galileo was a scientist who was going up against myth makers, and on this particular occasion Ted Cruz is the myth maker going up against scientists, but decided instead, as a consequence of his intervention just last week when responding to the Green New Deal, this is Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who stood up on the floor of the Senate with this placard behind him. And he said, the solution to climate change, just like the solution to most problems we face in the world, is for us to fall in love, get married, and have babies. This is one of the leaders of this country. This is someone who gets to determine the policy direction that this country will undertake over the course of the coming years. And this is how this particular individual is addressing the dominant issue that will face this century. Now, the reason he's wrong is illustrated on this slide on the bottom right-hand side. And that is that 97% of all the peer-reviewed published science, going back decades, supports what I said earlier, unequivocal, accelerating, human-induced. So he is now trading in myths, and he is ignoring science. And someone like this needs to be battled. But that brings me to what I had promised our friend earlier, which is a breakdown of the different types of constituents we need to deal with if we are to build a social and societal consensus on this particular issue. It would be very, very easy to simply say that everybody who disagreed with climate action and ambition is an equivalent of Mike Lee of Utah. That's not the reality of the situation. In fact, what you have first and foremost are people who are uninformed. One of the reasons why they're uninformed is because people like me have done a terrible job of communicating climate change. We've talked in jargon. We have talked in inaccessible language. We have published our findings in places where nobody goes, but journals nobody reads. We have spoken to what excites us. We have never spoken about what excites them. We have made the material inaccessible and not often actionable. We have not translated climate risk sufficiently into human impacts on jobs and health and lives. So there's a whole series of people out there who are uninformed. The strategy to bring those people into our coalition is outreach and empathy. It's about listening to them. It's about understanding what excites them and what motivates them. It's about learning their incentives and speaking to those incentives. It is not about being sanctimonious or self-righteous. It is not about labeling them. It's about outreach. The second group, not that far removed from the uninformed, except that they are misinformed, because they are getting information on this particular issue, but they're being told lies. They're turning into broadcasters that are telling them that climate change is a hoax. There's basically a whole series of denier arguments. The first argument is, this is not real. The second argument is, well, it is real, but we're not causing it. The third argument is, well, it is real and we are causing it, but it's not important. The fourth argument is, it is real, we are causing it, it is important, but there's nothing we can do about it. The fifth argument is, it is real, we are causing it, it is important, there's something we can do about it, but it's too costly. All of these arguments are presented like watching a film of the trenches moving in World War I. When they lose the first argument, they retreat to the second argument, and then they retreat to the third argument. And these arguments are propagated in places like Fox News and in other internet locations, TV locations, and newspapers. I don't blame the people who are misinformed. The strategy for those people is the same. They need information and outreach, but they need something different. They also need credible champions. A left-wing Democrat from one of the coastal elites is not going to persuade those people. So that means, in order to reach the misinformed, we need to create a new generation of leaders. We need to say to Al Gore, thank you for your service. Thank you for everything you've done. But you are now not going to persuade any new people. We need to find people who are conservative and Republican, people who might be evangelical. We need to find people who are working in the private sector and who are major employers in the districts that are controlled by conservative Republicans. We need to find people who are not only creating jobs in those districts, but are contributing campaign finance within those districts. Essentially what we need are what's called influence champions. Third category are those who feel squeezed out. For example, some of the politicians that I mentioned earlier. People who feel that they simply cannot embrace and lead on this issue because they won't be warmly accepted. What we've got to do is we've got to give them an on-ramp so that they can embrace this issue. That is extremely uncomfortable. I recently was part of a team developing a strategy for a major philanthropy that was all about identifying Republicans in the House and Senate who might be willing to vote favorably on this particular issue and providing them with some degree of political support and welcome. And a number of the people I worked with said to me, why on earth would we do that? Why on earth would we help these people create a profile for themselves that might lead to them being re-elected? Don't we want to get rid of these people? Only if you're short-sighted. Because ultimately we have to recognize the fact that we do share this country and this continent with people who have a different opinion, and we're going to have to learn to accommodate those views, and we're going to have to learn to bring them into this conversation. And we can't do that if we constantly label climate ambition as being a liberal Democrat issue. And then finally, there are those who are misleading. Those who are misleading are not deserving of our empathy and our outreach. They are simply in need of warriors to defeat them. So this morning I gave a talk, for example, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, very well received But after the talk, a couple of people came up to me and they said, we really didn't like this image. You really shouldn't have used this image. You could have made your point without using this image. They're right, I could have done that. And I'm going to spend an awful lot of my time over the coming 20 years trying to reach out to the uninformed and the misinformed, and trying to create a space for those who are squeezed out. But I will not tolerate for 1 second anymore people who deny climate science. I will not tolerate anymore people in positions of power who are using that power to mislead, whether they are people in politics or people in the media. Because one of the failures of climate scientists is that we have refused to speak truth to power. We have caveated everything that we have said. We have been too gentle in our conversations. We have deferred too often to politicians and broadcasters who wish to mislead. The time for that is over. Now we have to reach out to those who can be reached, and we have to defeat those who need to be defeated. The Green New Deal is another important development during the course of the last 18 months, during the course of the early part of this year. How many people are familiar with the Green New Deal? Just familiar. You've heard the concept. How many people have actually read it? Okay, fewer people. It's worth reading. Like any other important political document, it has what's called preambular language, which outlines the aims and the historical legacy that it is building upon. Like any other good bill, it has what is called operative paragraphs, the types of things that it is actually going to do. It is a very, very beautifully written document. It's built upon an extremely solid evidence base. And yet, if you were to ask me, is the Green New Deal a good idea, I would say absolutely not. And the reason why I think it's not a good idea is because of what's written on this slide. When we were writing the Green New Deal, did we give people an opportunity to say yes, or did we give them a reason to say no? Most of the reporting around the Green New Deal is not about the beautiful language. It's not even about the aspirations and the commitments that are identified. It's not even about the mechanisms that are going to be used in order to get us to those aspirational targets. It's about the fact that the Green New Deal offers a federally mandated job to anybody who wants one. Why on earth was there a need to put that in the Green New Deal? The reason I say that is not because a job is a bad thing. It's not even a bad thing to promise everyone a government job. If that's your political persuasion, okay. But when you put something like that into a document that's about building a low-carbon, climate-resilient world, you immediately provide people with a reason to say no, as opposed to an opportunity to say yes. You immediately shut down precisely what we need to initiate, which is a broader societal conversation that brings new people into the conversation. As a consequence of that, you now have the Democratic Party split on this issue, where those who are looking for the, quote, progressive vote are embracing the Green New Deal, and those who are looking to position themselves in the moderate lane are rejecting the Green New Deal. So the point is, this may be a very solid document in terms of its identification of the problem and in terms of how it proposes a solution. But when it comes to the political subtleties and the political sophistication of the document, it falls far short. And again, this is really important as a signal to us as a community that if we are going to be successful in reaching out to people who don't agree with us, then at the very minimum, we should not be putting in things that will trigger a negative response. Okay, before we move on to Vermont, there were people who had comments about the politics at the US federal level, so maybe I can invite you to give those comments right now, if you still have them. Please.
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned that Clinton, around Clinton and the early years of Obama. So what were their reasons for not participating in the global climate change meetings?
So with the case of the Clinton administration, they actually were the architects of the Kyoto Protocol. It was US diplomacy and US ideas that created the Kyoto Protocol. But when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, there was a global summit that took place in Berlin, and it led to something called the Berlin Mandate. And essentially what that said was that a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities needed to be embedded not only in the signature treaty of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but in any instruments such as the Kyoto Protocol. That's actually political shorthand for you in the industrialized world broke the climate system, therefore you have to fix it. You have to reduce your emissions, but we in China and India and Brazil and elsewhere, we're not going to do that. We need to have space to develop, we need to have the freedom to emit, therefore we're going to continue to emit while you begin the process of reducing your emissions. Now the European Union and other industrialized countries agreed to proceed on that basis for a limited time period. But there was a vote in the US Senate, and the US Senate rejected the Berlin mandate by a substantial vote. I believe it was something like 95, 97 to 1, something along those lines. And the reason they did that was because the argument was brewing. How on earth can you allow China to continue to emit? All of our industries will relocate to China. All of our jobs will go to China. We're going to have to carry this burden. China will have to do nothing. So the Clinton administration, when they saw this vote, decided that they would not submit the Kyoto Protocol to Congress for ratification because they knew the votes weren't there to actually ratify it. So it was a political calculus more than anything else. The Bush years, of course, was partly because fossil fuel companies were writing the energy policy and the government was populated not by people to the same extremes as the Trump administration, but certainly by people who wanted to very much slow down climate negotiations to a snail pace. Then when you have the first years of the Obama administration, what they were mostly concerned with was how do we get rid of this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities? How do we make sure that we get to a point where all countries act to reduce our emissions so that we can go back to the Congress and to the population at large and say, yes, we're acting, but every other country is acting too. So the Paris Agreement architecture, which says every country should act to the limit of its own capabilities, that architecture was again designed in Washington. And so it's again a great surprise that for the second time, a child born in Washington is being orphaned by Washington. Great surprise. Were there any others? Yes.
I just wondered if you could say again, before you advance to this slide, the reason why the Green New Deal, you said there's one piece of it that makes it not a good thing. Could you just say that again and explain what that is?
Yes. So the Green New Deal contains, as I said, a very, very strong evidence base, politically and scientifically, about how we got to where we are today. It contains very good ideas and very ambitious targets for what we should do over the course of the coming decade. It talks about what we need to do on renewable energies. It talks about what we need to do writ large to decarbonize the economy. It talks about mobilizing at a scale commensurate, for example, with how we mobilized for the Second World War. So it's very, very big on ambition. But the two major criticisms of it are first and foremost that it's long on ambition and short on feasibility. That to actually realize what's in the Green New Deal would take far more money than is available. It's simply not possible to reach those targets in this time frame. That's the first criticism. I don't particularly hold to that criticism because it's quite common for people to set a stretch target and you simply start the process of trying to meet that target. And it gives you a sense of direction, it gives you a ultimate destination for your journey, and even if you don't meet it, it gives you milestones along the way. So I don't have that particular problem with the Green New Deal. But the big problem that I have is once it gets into issues of social and economic policy, specifically the idea that the federal government will offer a mandate of a job for anybody who wants one. That's where the Green New Deal starts to fall down, not necessarily, again, from my own political persuasion, but because it makes it impossible for us to bring in other people on the opposite side of the aisle for them to support it, and it makes it impossible for moderate Democrats to support it.
I've heard criticism of the Green New Deal in terms of the cap and trade business, and I'm not quite clear on all that, but have you heard those same criticisms of the Green New Deal? Where is that criticism? Explain that criticism, the cap and trade business.
There's lots of criticism of the Green New Deal. I'm simply relaying why I feel that there's a problem with it. I don't, for example, have a problem with the cap and trade system. So from my perspective, the criticism on the types of mechanisms that it might use They're fair criticisms. Every criticism is legitimate to a certain extent.
Right.
I don't share that particular criticism. The way I deal with the Green New Deal is it falls apart because it tries to do too much
No, I
in a way that serves as a trigger to other people on the other side of the aisle.
I understand that, but I thought that you get more into the cap and trade business. Some companies produce a lot of carbon, and some companies, produce carbon, and then they trade it. You know, there's an encouragement for some companies to create carbon, and others not to create carbon. That's what I've heard some people from Brazil, for instance, criticizing that aspect of not just the Green New Deal, but policy in general.
So a carbon price can be done in multiple ways, and there are about 72 carbon pricing systems right around the world. Some of those take the form of taxes, some of them take the form of emissions trading systems, cap and trade. The devil is in the detail. The idea of a carbon price, the idea of an emissions trading system, it's sort of neutral until you get to the position where you're designing it. So ideally, a cap and trade system allocates permits to allow you to pollute. You buy those permits. If you don't use all of those permits, you can sell your surplus and make a profit. So there's an inducement for you to reduce your emissions because you can monetize the emissions that you do not emit. What also then happens is that progressively over time, the amount of permits that are allocated, either free or ideally by auction, that they're reduced sometimes annually, sometimes across 3, 4, 5 years. So you're over time reducing the amount of overall pollution that can go into the atmosphere, taking account of the money that's been raised previously, reinvesting that money into new technologies so that the innovations are present that will actually allow you to reduce emissions. So basically, it's what's called a market mechanism to help the real economy decarbonize. The issue is the detail, but the real issue is, does it help to drive down emissions or does it not? Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk about the Essex Plan. Is everyone familiar with the Essex Plan? So the Essex Plan is a proposal for a carbon price in Vermont. And part of the problem with the Essex Plan is that it doesn't necessarily lead to emissions reductions. What it might simply lead to is a circulation of money in the economy. So that's why I'm saying when it comes to the Green New Deal, when it comes to emissions trading more broadly, when it comes to the Essex Plan, it's not really about emissions trading, it's about the detail within a specific emissions trading plan.
Karen?
Back to the Green New Deal for a moment. It's not the first Green New Deal. The Green parties, I happen to like the Green Party's version better, that is, 10, 12, from 2006, I think. But I think it was understood that it wasn't gonna kind of happen right away. One of the things that I'm excited about is a movement that's really small so far. Science for the People is starting a process called the People's Green New Deal, which is really reaching out, as you had said, to people who are uninformed, misinformed, and holding hearings in communities around the country. And in those hearings, listening to how people are affected by climate change already, looking at the details of the Green New Deal, and not in a sense of this is hard and fast, but this is something that is going to be tinkered with. How do you, as citizens of this local community, of this, in particular, frontline marginalized groups of people, which includes lots of rural Vermonters, right? How do you think it's important? What are the things that you think should be in a Green New Deal? So in that sense, it offers a lot of promise if we grab hold of it and use it in just the way you said, to reach out to people, to empathize with what people are living through already. and use it as an educational tool and a tool to help people become part of the conversation that will shift those leaders.
How shall I put this? I have worked on this issue for 22 years. I'm tired of being right. Now I just want to win. And the reason I'm saying that is because being right about these issues has gotten us so far, but not far enough. So my problem with the Green New Deal is not that it isn't right, it's that it doesn't give us the opportunity to win. That's the problem. Because what we've got to ask ourselves is, in all of these community meetings we have, how many people who disagree with us come to these meetings? I spoke to 200 people last night. I spoke to 200 people this morning. I'm speaking to all of you today. I'm speaking in Albany in a couple of days. I'll probably speak to about 600 people this week on this issue. I would be surprised if 20 of those 600 people didn't already agree with me. I would be surprised if 20 of those people voted for Donald Trump. I might be wrong about that. But my experience going around the world is that it's easy to talk to people who already agree with me. But we're not doing what we need to do to win. And we're now at the point where sitting around and feeling happy about the fact that we know something that other people don't know is not good enough. We've now reached the point where we've got to persuade, not just inform, we've got to persuade. And my problem with the Green New Deal is not that it isn't loaded with good stuff, it's that it's not going to persuade. It's not going to change a single mind. It didn't move a single Republican member of the House or the Senate. In fact, it lost Democratic members of the House and the Senate. That's my problem with it. Full of good stuff. But one of the things that I struggle with, and I'm sure people in this room struggle with, is that, I'll get onto this again in a moment, is we are not in a position where we have the luxury to always pick perfect. One of the things we have to do as climate activists is we have to make tough choices. Sometimes we have to make tough choices between, for example, how much of our transitional fuel, until the point where renewable energy can really satisfy our needs, will be derived from nuclear power. Some people in this room will legitimately say, absolutely none. I don't like nuclear power. I don't like the waste. I don't like the security issues. I don't like the safety issues. Very legitimately, many people will say that. But equally legitimately, other people will say, if we don't have nuclear power as a proportion of our energy mix during a transitional phase, we will not be able to hold temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. So we are going to have to make difficult choices. And I just don't believe that the Green New Deal is honest about the difficult choices that we have to make. So again, for me, because of how long I've worked on this issue, it always boils down to the issue of, does this set us up to win or not? And if it doesn't set us up to win, if instead it gives people the opportunity to go on television and say, they're trying to take your hamburger from you, then I'm not going to be supportive of it as an initiative. I'm just simply illustrating that to say that there's a perspective as a consequence of really a burning desire at this point to try and win on this particular issue. And that means making some hard choices. So speaking of hard choices, we're going to look at Vermont quickly. And recently I had the opportunity to visit with lawmakers in Montpelier and to talk to them about climate change, low carbon, climate resilient and inclusive development. And what's really interesting is that it was important that we started the conversation by actually asking people in the room, what are you seeking to achieve? Are you seeking to achieve the reduction of greenhouse gases in Vermont? Or are you seeking to work towards decarbonization? Or are you seeking to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy? Now, some people in the room said, well, they're all the same thing, aren't they? Why are you asking us to choose between things that are all identical? And the reality is they are not identical, because Vermont is responsible for 0.1% of 26% of global emissions. So if your cause is safeguarding the global climate, but your focus is on moving a target in Vermont from 50% emissions reductions target to 52% emissions reductions target, you're really not making a contribution to this second idea, which is deep decarbonization. you're really only playing around at the margins. It might make you feel good about yourself, it might make us feel good about Vermont, but it's not really contributing to solving a global problem, because Vermont's footprint is so low. However, if you're focusing on the second issue of working towards decarbonization, that leaves you the room to be a bit more imaginative and creative. For example, Vermont was one of the states that signed on to Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007. And as a consequence of doing that, Vermont played a far greater role nationally and internationally than simply putting in place emissions reductions targets in the State House in Montpelier would have achieved. So there are creative, imaginative things that we can do that move us beyond the first question to the second question. And then the third question, that gets us out of environment and ecology and into social policy. So for example, if we are designing a carbon tax, are we putting in place social safety nets to make sure that the price of pollution is not passed on to low-income populations? Are we thinking about a minimum living wage as part of our climate portfolio to make sure people can gather the financial resources they need in order to rebound from an extreme weather event? Are we tackling the structural inequalities that I mentioned earlier when talking about women? Are we mobilizing public policy beyond energy policy? Are we thinking about how we utilize public procurement? Are we thinking about how we write the tax code? Are we thinking about how we break up the monopoly power of Green Mountain Power? These are very, very important questions that might lead us to scalable solutions, but only if we're asking ourselves the third question as opposed to always focusing on the first question. So I've already mentioned some things about, yes, please.
We need to go further and start thinking in terms of degrowth, reducing our consumption.
Yes.
But nobody's willing to even state that nowadays, except for some minor scientists.
I don't know if that's the case globally. I think there are many people globally who do talk about the fact that not only consumerism, but materialism is a major, major problem that we need to address. I think people talk about it in terms of, for example, mobility patterns, about the fact that we need to have public transport options as opposed to everybody feeling the need to own a large car. I think people are talking about it in terms of discussions around scaling down the size of homes that we have to use.
Yeah, but in this country, the people, political leaders are still emphasizing it as a capitalist country. Will always be a capitalist country.
Then we've got to change that.
Even the Democrats, even Nancy Pelosi has made statements to that effect.
Then we've got to change that. And there are plenty of people who are trying to do that. So for example, there's a movement globally to try and move us away from measuring the success of our economy through GDP and instead looking at something called GNI. There is a movement underway within the private sector to abolish quarterly reporting so that you don't have to report increased profits every quarter, but can instead concentrate on the long-term financial and environmental and social sustainability of your company. So there are movements. There's also movements underway, strangely enough, within the consumer products industry to start helping people to think about lifestyle as opposed to consumption. So I think it's important that we try to reflect that back in the United States. And we try to reflect that within our politics. But it's also important that we don't only think about what's going on in the United States as being a reflection of what's happening elsewhere. We have to take the best of what's happening elsewhere and bring it here, and we have to take the best of what's happening here and bring it elsewhere as well. Okay, let's continue because I'm conscious of the time. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to say about what's going on in Vermont. Are people in the room aware that the governor initiated a Vermont Climate Change Commission? Yeah, people are aware of that. Has anybody in the room read the report? No, okay. So this report was presented to the governor last year, and it contains 53 different recommendations on what the state can do in order to rapidly reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. It includes things like, for example, weatherizing homes. It includes things like enhancing the infrastructure to facilitate electric vehicles. It talks about more renewable energy in the mix, and so on. A total of 53 different recommendations spanning energy and agriculture and transport and other sectors of the economy. Now again, if your question is the first question that I showed on that slide, then this is a pretty good report from this commission. But if you have the longer game in mind and you want to ask the second or the third question, then what this is revealed as is being incredibly incremental and only dealing with emissions reductions, not really focusing on resilience and not really focusing on finance. Now, one of the things that has happened recently, which I'm sure you've all read about, and I'm sure you're all affected by, is the fact that liberal arts colleges right across the region are closing. Green Mountain College, St. Joseph's, Southern Vermont College, Marlborough College is not far off, Bennington College is not far off, a whole series, Hampshire College, right across the region, right across the country. Approximately 50% of liberal arts colleges in the States are currently underwater and threatened with closure. Now, if we want to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive world, who is going to build the wind turbines? Who is going to weatherize the homes? Who is going to put solar panels on your roof? Who is going to engage in regenerative agriculture and forestry? Who is going to revolutionize our transport and mobility systems? Who is going to seize the economic opportunity that I mentioned earlier? Who is going to use that economic opportunity as an option for investing in human capital? Why are we concentrated on this while at the same time allowing our institutes of learning that are going to provide an education and a livelihood to our young people to close? It's because quite often our focus is on incrementalism and our focus is too narrowly focused on energy and the environment. The Essex Plan, something that I mentioned a moment ago, this is the embryonic carbon pricing system that's happening at the moment, conversations in Montpelier around this. And again, my view is a carbon price is a good thing. It can be very efficient, it can be very effective in terms of reducing emissions. But what's very important is that we always have to look at the detail. For example, is the carbon price going to lead to a reduction in emissions? At the moment, I'm unclear as to whether the Essex Plan would reduce emissions, because it will impose a tax on fuel, but it will reimburse the cost of that tax back to populations who are using a lot of fuel. So instead of reducing the emissions, it might actually become a circular payment between the person paying a tax at the fuel pump and the government reimbursing the money back to that person. In theory, it could become that. Now, there are ways of ironing that out, and hopefully as this plan advances, those ways will be found. Similarly, it's very, very important when you design a carbon price that you do not impose an unnecessarily high burden on low-income and vulnerable populations, because you may end up exacerbating their risk as opposed to building resilience. At the moment, this plan and conversations around it are very, very short in terms of discussions around social safety net and safeguards. So what I would suggest is that people should really take the time to read this, become aware of it, and form an opinion on it. There are some very good elements to it. There are some questions still remaining. One of the largest questions remaining about it is it worth the investment of political capital? And if not, what are the alternatives? Because it's going to be very difficult to get politicians to embrace this when they're turning on their television and they're seeing the so-called yellow vest protests in Paris. Are you familiar with the yellow vest protests? So this is a broad-based movement in France that is related to all manner of things, but the trigger has been the imposition of a carbon price in France. That's not the only reason, but that is a trigger. So politicians are looking at this now and they're thinking, do we want that for us? And there has already been yellow vest protests outside the State House in Montpelier, even before something has really advanced. So a question for politicians is Is this the best way to reduce emissions and generate revenue that the state can reinvest, or is there an alternative? Well, one alternative is that Vermont is 70% forest land. And as a consequence of that, Vermont is able to keep its greenhouse gas emissions very low. In fact, Vermont has the lowest emissions of any state in the nation. So one way that you could generate revenue that could be earmarked for reinvestment in agriculture, in transport, in energy emissions reductions, is to use some of Vermont's forests and the carbon sink that they offer to generate carbon credits that could lead to revenue earmarked for reinvestment. That's one alternative that might be more politically feasible than going down the road of a carbon tax. There are other alternatives as well, but my suggestion is, again, we always have to be very clear-eyed about what the alternatives are, what the financial and political implications of different choices are, so that we can find an option that is both ambitious, but also is feasible in terms of its prospects. When I spoke to the lawmakers in Montpelier, what I was trying to do was to suggest to them ways in which they could start thinking a little bit more creatively about some of the policy making going on there. So for example, I suggested that we should be thinking about changing our public procurement rules, so that instead of giving public contracts to the lowest tender, that you give public contracts to those tenders that are socially and environmentally responsible. That can have an impact in Vermont, but if you look at other parts of the world, the potential is enormous. So 19% of all GDP in China is public procurement. If you were to green that public procurement in China, you would send not only a huge economic stimulus within China, but across the rest of the world. What I've also suggested is that they think about marketing Vermont and its green energy economy. And the reason for that is because I've mentioned these 6,000 companies around the world who've taken climate commitments. Many of them have taken commitments to procure 100% of their energy from renewable sources. And some of those companies, I'm going to show you a couple of examples now. I think if it's in here, maybe it's not in here. Some of those companies are making location decisions based on the availability of green energy. So imagine for a second you are a data center in Alabama. Alabama will only provide you with fossil fuel. So either you stay in Alabama and you fail to honor your climate commitment, or you relocate. The province of Quebec is going to these companies and saying to them, why don't you relocate to Quebec? We will give you all the green energy you need. You can fulfill your obligation to your shareholders, but in return, you will bring your investment and you will bring your jobs to us. Now, when you think of Vermont as suffering from a low tax base, a median age of 43 years old, an inability to retain young people, an inability to attract young people, wouldn't it be great if some of those companies were able to move here based on the availability of affordable energy? I'm not suggesting that we inundate the state with these companies. I'm simply suggesting that they are now making business decisions based on something that we have to offer. Why aren't we out there offering it to them? I'm going to start to wrap up by making some suggestions and tying all of this together into what I've described as the new climate leadership. What are the types of things we should be thinking about and the types of practices we should be pursuing? The first thing is we need to do better at understanding the problems in order to find the right solutions. If you don't diagnose something appropriately, it is impossible to find the right solution. I have epilepsy. For the longest time, people with epilepsy were thought to have demons in their head, and the solution was to drill a hole in the side of your head. Not a very good diagnosis, leading to a terrible solution. Similarly, when it comes to climate change, if we don't properly diagnose risk as being not just the existence of a climate hazard, but the structural discrimination that amplifies risk, then we can't put in place the right strategies for resilience. If we only identify climate change as the consequence of energy, and we miss the other sectors that are involved, we limit our ability to solve the problem. So it starts with a sound diagnosis. It then continues with creating a baseline. This is something that governments should do, this is something that companies can do, it's something that we should do as individuals. There's an old adage in climate change that your footprint is basically food, fuel, and footnotes, meaning that it's really about what you eat, where your food comes from, how you heat and power your home, how you power your vehicle. So if you really want to make a difference in your own life on this issue, you start by understanding where your emissions are. And it inevitably leads you to thinking about what energy you use in your home, but also what energy efficiency you have in your home. And it also gets you into thinking about your diet. If cows were a country, they would be somewhere between the 3rd and 5th largest emitters in the world. So a very important way in which we can reduce our footprint, and a way that is going to be challenging for Vermont, is that we have got to reduce our consumption of beef. We've especially got to do that because we are facing a global rise in population from 7 billion trending towards 10 billion, and we're facing a rise in the global middle class with people who traditionally have had a vegetarian diet moving more towards meat-based diets. So we cannot take this issue seriously while continuing to be mass consumers of livestock. So you have to create a baseline, live your values, and then you become more credible in being able to advocate similar sorts of solutions to companies and to governments as well.
I am not an advocate of eating animals or any of their products. However, rotational grazing and regenerating the soils, animals are integral in that. So if, you know, there is a way of having beef or animal products that could be actually helpful to the environment. But it requires that type of, you know, change in the agricultural process that is raising these animals. I don't condone it. I mean, I just know that if you think about historically, that the animals that roam through the grasslands, and it is taking grasslands and not taking good cropland that we could be using for growing vegetables. But doing that in the grasslands would really be a helpful thing.
I'm sure that that's correct in the sense that the models that you're talking about of regenerative agriculture are important, and enhancing the capacity of soils to capture and store carbon is extremely important. I don't think that we can do that on a scale of 10 billion people pursuing the same sort of model that we have now.
Yeah, I just would think the price point of beef that's raised in a way that would be regenerative will be to a point where you can't consume it as a main course,
Yep.
you know, covering a plate. It'll be a condiment, which is the way we should be eating it anyway, but if we eat it at all.
And this is not about saying to people you have to give up your hamburger. It is about saying think seriously about what you eat, think seriously about where it comes from. If you're consuming beef that comes from the farm next door and is produced in the way you're suggesting, obviously far better than producing or consuming beef that has been transported all the way from Alberta, having been raised on an industrial farm. So yes, and in a moment I'm going to talk about the fact that you need to make tough choices based on the proper information, and what you're saying is an illustration of that, in fact. We also need to strengthen resilience. This is something you can do in your ordinary life, but it's also something we have to advocate that is done by government and by companies. There are essentially 6 building blocks to how we go about building resilience. For example, we need to tackle financial capital. That doesn't just mean moving more money away from high carbon towards low carbon. It means opening up access to financial services, goods, and vehicles to marginalized and vulnerable populations. Human capital. Extremely important, what I mentioned earlier on. If we allow our human capital to drain away, then who is going to build the low carbon, climate resilient economy of tomorrow? Political capital. We've got to invest in our political process. We've got to make it our business to revise and revitalize our political systems, because the policy enabling environment can often be the difference between progress or regression. We've got to think beyond environmental policy. One of the things that has happened recently in Vermont that you might have noticed is that there has been a renewable energy tax credit to help people to put solar panels on their homes, for example. It used to be that if you had a solar-powered home, that you could sell your surplus back into the grid and make a profit on your energy surplus. There has been a movement away from that. Now instead, what Green Mountain Power does is it sells you a Tesla Powerwall. And instead of selling your surplus back to Green Mountain Power and making a profit, you are now acting as a battery for Green Mountain Power that they can draw upon when they have peak energy demand. So that is an example of beyond an environmental policy, a monopoly issue, an issue of the behavior of a powerful incumbent that needs to be changed and that we need to think about and not just advocate for the next environmental legislation. I've mentioned that already. It's very important that we all become educators, not just in terms of how we go about tackling the Heartland Institute, not just in terms of how we spend our time educating those who are closest to us about this issue, but also in terms of how we go about building this societal consensus and reaching out and having uncomfortable conversations in unusual places. It's very important that we think about how we activate our captive audience. One of the leading companies on climate change is actually Walmart. Very bad on social issues, but one of the leading companies in the world on climate change. They've put in place a science-based emissions reductions target. They have 100,000 suppliers across the United States alone. Those suppliers will have to respond by being low carbon themselves. But one of the things that Walmart is not doing that it could do is it could begin the process of educating its workforce, educating its suppliers, and educating its consumers. Because this graphic reveals that Walmart is the largest employer in 22 states around the nation, including the largest employer in our neighbors in New Hampshire. So if Walmart was to speak more publicly about this issue, if you were to walk into Walmart and be educated about climate as you go around the store doing your shopping, that would make a huge difference, because look at the parts of the country where Walmart is the dominant employer. It's the parts of the country that are not as ambitious and active on this issue as they can be and as they need to be.
Why would they do that if they're Walmart K through 12?
The reason why they will do that is because when Walmart announced its science-based emissions reduction target, it could have announced it at the US Federation of Retailers or at the US Grocers Association or at a conference organized by Business for Social Responsibility. But instead, the CEO of Walmart decided to announce this at Net Impact, which is a gathering of millennials. And the reason he did that is because his consumer base is dying out. And he wants new people to come and shop at Walmart. And he's afraid that they will not shop at Walmart unless they're seen to being a progressive company on this and other issues. So he's afraid that he's going to lose consumers unless he goes in the right direction. But he needs to follow through on that and not just speak at a conference. He needs to begin to educate people in his stores.
But at the same time, they have that K through 12 program, which is Christian-based.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is insane.
I'm not defending Walmart. Okay, I'm not defending Walmart. I started by comments by saying they're terrible on social issues. So, for example, it is an atrocity that every year at Thanksgiving there has to be a food drive at Walmart so that the workers at Walmart can go home with a meal. So I'm not defending Walmart. What I'm saying is, again, factually based, they are one of the leading companies in the world on climate change. Now, you may disagree with their philosophy, but that's a fact. And I trade in facts.
Yeah, we're going to
Yeah.
feed you, we got to move on.
Okay.
Okay, but just, while I appreciate all the people in the climate movement and all the work and dedication, I think that statement that Walmart is a leader in reducing climate change is just the nub of the whole problem, where when you're saying we have to identify first the source of the problem, I mean, climate change is probably just a symptom of a civilizational problem. And just I mean, for them to meet certain green criteria, while they're producing all this garbage that we don't need in Chinese factories and then pushing it on us, I mean, it's just like, just to state that as in any way, well, but they're doing this on climate, it just shows you that we're just stuck in this, well, just like trying to convince the people who are Trump supporters somehow, but it's even, I think we're beyond even believing that rational argument, that humans are as rational as we think. We're talking about fascism. We're talking about mythology. We're talking about people choosing to listen to Fox News and choosing not to listen to the BBC. They have a choice, but it makes them feel good. So I'm just saying, while I appreciate all of this, I feel that it's not barely scratching the surface.
So what's your
wrong.
solution?
Capitalism.
I'm hoping that climate change actually helps bring down the industrial growth system, because there's no solution inside an industrial growth model. There is no sustainable capitalism. So
And what do you replace that with?
those who survive, we'll see what we come up with. Yeah. Well, the indigenous have survived 500 years of occupation, so I'm looking towards indigenous cultures to teach us and to, we'll see what happens. We don't know what's going to happen. But I'm just saying, within an industrial growth system, in my short lifetime, we've gone from 2.5 billion population, now we're heading towards 10. It's so obviously unsustainable as far as plastics in the ocean. I mean, it's not just CO2. It's everything that we've created. It's the whole mindset.
I would say that the solution is, like, I think I see, and this might be a generalization, that a lot of folks, us maybe in this room or on the left, tend to maybe think more rationally or have that belief about people that if we just educate or if we just spread the word, when all along the corporations and the people on the right are appealing to emotions. And we know that that's where people make decisions. And we know that that's what really influences people. You can't have a logical argument with someone who holds a belief that's tied to their emotional situation. So we need marketers along with our scientists. We need people with that background in persuasion and psychology. We need focus groups, just like the right did, to rebrand the estate tax as the death tax. Like, we're not using those tactics because it's kind of like we feel like we just need to tell people enough, or they'll just get it someday. But that's not the case. We need to create a compelling emotional argument. We might even need to make people angry, because anger is what gets people fired up, what turns people out. Like, we don't always look at that because it can kind of make people uncomfortable, but that's what capitalists, what those corporations have been doing all along. So for us to look at the system and to say what's bad, but then to know those things work and not participate, I don't have a better solution than to use their own tactics, but for a better purpose. So that's
So there's a couple of things that have been said, and I just want to respond to them very quickly. And the first thing that I want to say is, everybody is entitled to their belief system. Everybody's entitled to their philosophy. But there's a couple of things that have been said that I would argue are, at the very minimum, detrimental to our cause. To suggest those who survive, we'll see how it goes. That is the type of comment that makes people in places like India and China and Brazil and all across the developing world react badly when we try to propose climate ambition to them. Because what they say to us is, you're trying to tell us we need to go back to the Stone Age while you've profited off the carbon budget. So it's not fair to say to people that they have to go back and live an indigenous life, because people don't want to do that. And we have profited from this. And we've got to find a solution that provides people with equitable access to sustainable development, while at the same time managing a variety of different crises. And you're absolutely right, climate change isn't the only one. And we've got to try and find a way of solving this problem that is both ambitious, but it is also feasible. If you think we're going to be able to solve pollution without working with polluters, good luck to you. If you think we're going to be able to solve this problem by only reaching out to people who already agree with us, good luck to you. We're never going to be able to do that. Never. Now, I have found myself in my career in places that I found incredibly uncomfortable. I found myself going in to speak with governments who abuse human rights. I found myself going in to speak to companies who are the complete opposite of my values. Companies who are polluting. But I go in to speak to these people because they have to change. And they are not going to change with criticisms. They're going to change with inducements. I'm not suggesting we buy them off. I'm suggesting we give them an off-ramp. So again, this slide is not here to glorify Walmart. This slide is here to say Walmart can and should do more. Walmart can and should do better. Here is one way Walmart can and hopefully will do better. But we've got to start with where we are, not where we wish we are. And we've got to work with those who are causing the problem in order to get to a solution. Now, I also get uncomfortable when I hear about capitalism. What is capitalism? Is capitalism what the Scandinavians do? Is capitalism what the Germans do? Is capitalism what the Chinese are doing? Is capitalism what right-wing Republicans want us to do? Or is capitalism what Bill Clinton wanted us to do? There is no such thing as capitalism. There are different types of economic models that are based on the notion of individual freedom and free market economics. But they can be a welfare state with a 54% tax rate where you get 16 months of paternity like Sweden, or they can be a place like here where you can have 0-hour contracts, work 80 hours a week and still not be able to afford healthcare. So let's not use the word capitalism in a way that is, let's say, a little bit lacking in nuance. And let's also not misrepresent the fact that alternative economic systems, such as we had for a 50-year period between the mid-40s and the late 90s, was even more damaging to the environment. If you look at the amount of environmental degradation in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc countries, it even dwarfs what we've experienced here. So we've got to be very careful that we don't throw around terms and throw around models without, again, being factually based. And the reason why I say that is because part of my job is to go out to people who ignore facts and to encourage them and implore them, please look at the facts. Don't make your decision based on fear. Don't make your decision based on the fact that someone is lying to you. Don't make your decision based on a philosophy that is redundant and outdated. Make your decision based on a common understanding of facts. And if we as a community who are seeking to move people, if we don't subscribe to the facts, then what hope do we have of persuading those people to do it? So I'm not saying this to delegitimize what anybody has said. I'm simply saying, as I said at the outset, that a lot of my experience is based on working at this and failing and trying to learn from failure and coming back and trying again. And the conclusion I have reached, for what it is worth, and it's not for me to indoctrinate you, is that we cannot do this with only liberal Democrats. We can't. We can't only do it with Patagonia. We can't. If we could, I'd be delighted, but we can't.
So how do we frame arguments with people who don't believe it or don't want to believe it?
We find their story. So when I was first sent to Washington, D.C., it was my job to go to Capitol Hill and to advocate on behalf of the Maldives. One of the poorest countries in the world. It will disappear off the face of the earth by the end of this century. The reason why I go into these uncomfortable places is because I care about those people. It's not because I'm a defender of capitalism. So I would go to Congress and I would say ecology. And a certain number of people would listen to me and other doors would close. And then the next day I would go back and I would say competitiveness, more doors would open. And then I would go back the next day, human rights, more doors would open. And then I would go back the next day, stewardship of the earth and faith, more doors would open. I recently gave an hour-long talk at the Grace Church in Rutland, and it was based around scripture, Matthew. What profit a man if he wins the earth but lose his soul? You speak in the language of morality to faith-based organizations. You speak in the language of risk and reward to companies. You find what interests and excites and incentivizes someone, and you speak to them about that. You don't go in and say, polar bears, ice caps. You don't go in with what excited you, you go in with what is going to resonate with them. And more often than not in this country, it's not about only going in with those stories, it's about sending in the right messenger. Because a social democrat from Ireland who's an atheist is not going to get very far with an evangelical conservative Republican. So it's about a combination of finding the right story and about finding the right messenger. And if you do that, then you can move people. I mean, again, we're faced with a moment of unparalleled urgency, and it's very easy for us to be bogged down in that. But I started working on this in 1997, and if you told me in 1997 that 22 years later we would have the Paris Agreement and we would have half the global economy working on climate commitments, I would have shook your hand and said, I'll take it. So it's very, very easy for us to be confronted with the science and go, shit, this is a disaster. But we've also got to look at the other side of the equation, which is we're actually giving ourselves a foundation to build upon. And how are we going to use that foundation is actually the more important question. Right, I know that we have to wrap up, so I don't have anything more actually to say. I think we've covered everything. The last thing I'm going to do is simply give you my email address. Because if you want to reach out, if you want to carry on the conversation, if you want to have any of these slides, feel free to reach out, and you're welcome to have them.
So what I'd like to do is, number one, thank you so much again for coming. And I'd like to encourage you, especially to us average folks, part of everyday life, to talk about, maybe build a presentation on how we can create these alternative narratives in our everyday lives. Most of us are not public speakers like yourself, very articulate, very knowledgeable. We deal with our neighbors, we deal with our families, we deal with our schoolmates and our workmates. How can we begin to affect change with them? How can we begin to approach them in a way that is, listening to them, talking in terms that they understand? I think that is a loss, that we get to the point, I feel, in these conversations where we talk about government and how to approach politicians and stuff like that, but we don't get down to the everyday life of folks that are sitting in this room, who are going to be out in the streets, who are going to be in public places, and who have the opportunity, perhaps, to engage people, but don't feel confident, don't have the skills. So I would really encourage you to think about a presentation that would do just that, that would come in and assume that everyone in the room knows about climate change, but they don't know what they're going to do about it.
Well, let me stop you and say, first and foremost, that I do have a training course that's 18 hours long, and I wouldn't inflict that upon you.
Yes, please
But people in Manchester took that training course. The reality is, I can't tell you how to talk to Uncle Bob. I can't tell you how to talk to your neighbor. You've got to figure that out for yourself by building a relationship with him. You've got to develop the capacity yourself to go in and listen, as opposed to go in and preach. One of my experiences, which is very illustrative, is that diplomats are sent overseas to talk for their country. They're not sent overseas to listen for their country. So what you often have are diplomats making statements, and then when someone turns to respond, they're on their phones, not listening. So I can't tell you how to speak to your neighbor. What you need to do is you need to spend time figuring out your neighbor.
No, but you can be of use because you're learning stuff, how to be with our neighbors, which is different than talking to.
Yes.
How to present yourself, how to be with them. Anyway, I really appreciate what you did tonight. It was another great talk. We'll have you back in 2 years if we're still around.